Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for the last panel in our Friday Forum series, Housing and Homelessness, How to Move Forward Post-Pandemic. My name is Cynthia Stewart, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the network. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we're a membership and advocacy organization promoting the development of supportive housing as the answer to homelessness for individuals with behavioral health needs. In lieu of our annual in-person conference, the network has been hosting a series of online panels to help us move through and beyond COVID-19 and to reflect on the policies that support structural racism to help us emerge stronger and more equitable as a community. To date, we've had over 2,000 people join our series, which has been just incredible. Thank you to all who have attended. Special thank you to our sponsors and a huge shout out to our team, specifically Emily Levine, Maura McComas, and Joelle Balam-Schwan for creating this panel. Housekeeping note, we will reserve time at the end of this panel for questions and answers. Please submit your questions and answers in the Q&A box. The panel will be recorded and posted on our website. Lastly, thank you so much to Jessica Katz, who's the Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council, who's moderating today, and to our amazing panelists for sharing their thoughts on this incredibly important topic. So thank you so much, and over to you, Jessica.
Hi, Cynthia. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone who's joining us. It's a beautiful day outside today, so thanks for spending part of it with us. With any luck, it'll also be a beautiful day for democracy, a beautiful day for Black lives, a beautiful day for immigrants, a beautiful day for survivors of sexual assault, a beautiful day for people with disabilities, the LGBTQ+ community, and a beautiful day for women having control over our own bodies. So yes, we're looking forward to this beautiful day. Let's get started. I want to introduce our fantastic panelists today. First, we have Barika Williams, the Executive Director of the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development, or ANHD, as well as Binyamin Appelbaum, head writer and member of the editorial board at the New York Times. So thank you so much. We're here to talk about our homelessness and housing affordability crisis. So, you know, it's become a cliche at this point to talk about how COVID has laid bare some of the inequalities in our city, in our country, in our world. But the ground has shifted substantially, or in some ways we hope that it will shift after the COVID crisis. At the very least, we have a long overdue focus this year and going forward on systemic racism and how that affects our homelessness and housing crisis. And I will even go back a couple of disasters in New York City. And in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, I had sort of some possibly naive looking back hopes that given the huge number of people who were displaced and made homeless, at least temporarily after Superstorm Sandy, that would create a little bit of more empathy amongst New Yorkers about what that means and how close any one of us may be to homelessness, whether that's a missed paycheck, a slip and fall without health insurance, whether that's a storm or relapse or any number of different issues that might have somebody with a country with a frail social safety net to tumble into homelessness. That didn't happen. I'm not sure we're feeling more empathetic towards each other than we were back then, or more empathetic towards homeless people. But there are some buds of optimism that I see out on the horizon about where we might go on the housing and homelessness front. So I want to start with our panelists to just talk a little bit about where you think we are today, what the state of play is, and where we want to go forward. I'll start with Barika.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Jessica. Thanks for talking with us. And then thank you, of course, to the network for having this important conversation. And I just want to echo Jessica's opening statements and thoughts. You know, we're on the cusp of a lot of different things potentially happening today over the next few days. And I know that's not the focus of this, but I also want to recognize and lift up that it's in many of the audience's hearts and minds, and it impacts people very personally and impacts their day-to-day lives very differently depending on who they are, what their identity is, and how they move in this world and space. So just want to lift that up and hope that everybody is hanging in there in what is a difficult, potentially week, in a difficult year, in a difficult many years. So I think that then Jessica ties into what you're asking, which is, you know, a little bit of how did we get here, and what are folks facing? You know, we think about this, the COVID really is now the health and the economic and now a social crises that have really pulled back the veil. It's a little bit hard to say pulled back the veil because many of us already knew that it was just a veil and had been looking behind it for decades. But for many, kind of exposed what the inequities and the deep differences in how people are able to live and survive specifically in New York City. So we have huge rates of rent burden for folks who are unable to pay and keep up with their rent. We have a medium household income in New York City that is household income that is around $74,000, $75,000. So most people in New York City prior to COVID are existing on not $100,000, not $90,000, but figuring out how to pay rent or pay a mortgage with 75 or less in an annual year, in a city where there's escalating rents, where we were talking about rents being somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000, new construction units being $2,300. And so that's like, we're starting this with this dynamic of recognizing that we have a housing market that is far outpaced with our population. That who our folks are, who people are, and how they can live and manage their income is not in line with what our housing is, and creates this dynamic of what does that mean for housing affordability? What does that mean for safety and health and wellness of the buildings? What does that mean for people's potential to fall into homelessness and people's persistence and continual existence within homelessness and their inability potentially to move out of it. So I'll leave it there, Jessica, and keep going.
Great. Binyamin, do a little introduction for us as well about where you think you are and some of the work you've done on this topic at the Times.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, first and foremost. And, you know, when I talk, some of this history is probably familiar to the people in this audience, but when I talk to people about homelessness, I often start by telling them that in the 1950s and into the 1960s, many community leaders, many activists, many social scientists fully expected that the United States was going to eliminate homelessness, that this problem could be addressed completely, that we could provide housing for everyone and move forward. And by the 1980s, the tone of the conversation had shifted completely, and people were talking about homelessness as something permanent and intractable, as a problem that needed to be managed, but that at least many political leaders had lost confidence in the ability really ever to solve. And I mention that history because the people in the 60s were right. They were standing on the cusp of an era in which the United States had sufficient resources to ensure that everyone had adequate housing, that everyone had a roof over their head, a permanent place to live. And the choices that we made in the subsequent decades were not to use the resources that we had to address the problem. And as a consequence, we have the situation that is familiar to us all today, which is that in New York City and in other similarly high-priced cities, large numbers of Americans do not have a place to live, and many more live in jeopardy of ending up in that situation either tonight or the next week or the next time a rent check is due. And the problem is only intractable because we choose to treat it that way. It's only unsolvable because we haven't devoted sufficient resources and effort to it. And that frame, I think, is really the starting point for me, that this is a problem that we have the capacity to address. Not easy, the details matter and they're complicated, but I think it would be an enormously important first step if as a society we began to frame it as how do we solve this problem with the confidence that we can, rather than seeking to manage it. And you know, I'll just tip my hat as well to you know, the moment. We're expecting perhaps later today, perhaps in the coming days, that Joe Biden will be declared the winner in this presidential election, and he'll become the president-elect, and there'll be a lot of celebration. But elections are not victories for a candidate's agenda. They give you the opportunity to govern. The hard work lies ahead. And homelessness is an example of an area in which that hard work very much lies ahead. And hopefully there are a set of political actors who are more willing to engage it, but the work itself will remain to be done.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and add that as a constituency, homeless people experiencing homelessness are not necessarily always at the top of anybody's agenda. So they tend to fall way to the bottom of the list. And so as a political constituency, it's not always at the top of anybody's agenda to try to solve that. And despite how eminently solvable, as you point out, Binyamin, this problem is, given a lot of what Barika said and some other factors in the housing market, 60,000 homeless people in New York City is horrifying. It's a scandal. It's an abomination. But given what we know about the housing market in New York City, it's actually kind of a miracle that it's not 10 times that number. I mean, New Yorkers are really busting their butts every day in a way that is really, should, I guess, be celebrated, but mostly it just feels depressing to me that we're demanding this of people, of how close we're requiring people to come to homelessness and not providing that kind of support. I mean, particularly with family homelessness, one thing that we've seen is we have a very hard time in the family homelessness system predicting. Part of the failure of our programs is that we have a hard time predicting which of this huge ocean of extremely low income families will tumble into homelessness on any given day. And that's because those risk factors are there for a huge ocean of people. So that is a bit scary. I do want to turn a little bit to the public discourse around homelessness, since this is such a deeply political moment, and talk about one of the little green shoots of hope that I have seen. If anybody has not seen this video that a group called Upper West Side Open Hearts has put out about the children of the Upper West Side talking about their homeless neighbors and how they want to welcome them, I'll put a link to it in the chat. But if you're feeling kind of scared and anxious today, spend 3 minutes watching this video. It's totally going to change your mood. So I'll put it out to both of you. Let's talk a bit about the public discourse around housing and homelessness and whether that's shifted and whether there's some optimism there.
I can go first on this one, I guess. So I think you just said something really important for the sort of the discourse about this, which is that framing the issue as what do we do for people who are actually homeless, I think is a narrow and counterproductive frame. The proper frame is what do we do for all the people who might become homeless, all the people who live in unstable situations and might tomorrow become the person for whom the risk factors tilt the wrong way and the bottom falls out. And I think that broader frame of talking about this as an issue of affordable housing connects with a larger population of people who are themselves, forced to pay more for housing than they would like or unable to find the housing that they would like. It creates a commonality of experience with a broader population. And I think that we've seen in recent years a real upsurge of interest in this crisis of affordable housing in American cities, a real recognition that cities are becoming exclusive domains, that the people who work in cities are being pushed further and further from employment opportunities, that in the places that are prospering most, it is harder and harder to find affordable places to live and to participate in that prosperity. And that shift in public discourse, I think, has been enormously helpful. It obviously hasn't borne the kind of fruit that we might like yet, although in some areas, I think it is bearing fruit. We've seen, particularly on the West Coast, a shift in the willingness to deploy public resources to help people deal with housing affordability and homelessness. But I think the shift in discourse and dialogue is really elevating the issue in ways that point toward potential solutions.
What do you think, Barika?
And I think that some of what has unfolded, especially recently on the Upper West Side around homelessness shelters, really helped expose and dispose of this myth in New York City that we didn't have the same issues talking about affordable housing and homelessness as other places in the country. No, we aren't a city, and we are fortunate that we are not a city that has to relabel and reveil affordable housing as workforce housing in order for it even to be something, be a project that goes forward, be a conversation that folks have. So we're fortunate in that regard, but that is not the same thing as recognizing that there are people who are deeply oppositional to affordable housing, to homelessness, to shelters and supportive services in their neighborhoods and in their communities. And that definitely exists as part of New York City's fabric and framework. And we're really seeing that play out in recent months and in light of COVID as we have increased housing instability and the need and the importance of being able to try to address that, and the recognition that we should have long ago, but in this moment needed to not address that concentrated in the same neighborhoods that have always had to deal with it in the past, right? It's not as if these shelters haven't existed in New York City in the past, it's that we've continued to isolate them into certain communities. And now we're saying, okay, well, we need to now think about having these shelters potentially play out in other places and seeing that opposition really erupt. And I think the other piece of this is that we need to give a lot of credit to the grassroots groups, the grassroots movements, the non-for-profit groups. To Binyamin's credit and to others, we have actually a very robust press network here in New York City that talks about the built environment and talks about urban issues. And so with those different pieces, we are constantly pushing on the importance of affordable housing, the importance of supportive housing, the importance of tenants' rights in a way that is relentless and oftentimes, to be honest, dismissed by government and dismissed by many actors and not acknowledged, but has made many of the inroads and gains that even allow us to hold steady. To Jessica, to your point, it's miraculous that we're not further back. They are the line that is allowing us to hold where we are and not slip into an even deeper crisis than we've already been.
Yeah, so, and as we've talked about, other developments over the past year have been, I would say a year ago, the phrase Black Lives Matter was really the language of a small group of activists. So it's not that many other people didn't believe that to be the case, but it's not a phrase that you would necessarily associate with. Now, you can't buy a pair of yoga pants without somebody telling you that Black Lives Matter. So how does that sort of progressivism that we believe is so much part of our DNA here in New York, square or not square, with some of these other things that we've seen in terms of homelessness and kind of resistance to new housing? Binyamin, I'll give you this one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd make 2 points, and they kind of move in opposite directions, but I'm going to make both of them anyways. The first is, I think that President Trump's 4 years, one positive effect in an odd way is that it has forced people who spent a lot of time squabbling with each other to recognize what they have in common, what they hold dear, and what they need to defend. And we've seen the emergence of a certain sense of commonality of interest around around issues that frankly had trouble, getting people to stand together and to recognize their values that they held in common. And so, I think the Black Lives Matter movement, which has deserved to exist for a long time, the problems are not new, the experience is not new, but the willingness of much of the community to stand with Black people who are facing these experiences is new. And I think it frankly emerged in large part from a sense of unified opposition to this president and to this administration, as well as the specific catalysts. But again, these kinds of catalysts have always been available. These events happen regularly. And so the fact that people were finally willing to stand up and say, enough, we will not tolerate this anymore, was a new thing in the world. And I think really reflects the broader political environment. The flip side of that is that you continue to see, and so this is not, you see this in less in New York than in New York suburbs, but also in many other American cities, this phenomenon where, I think of it as a lawn sign phenomenon where people will have, their BLM sign on their lawn, and right next to it is their sign protesting the proposed affordable housing development that's coming in just down the street. And they plant those things in their lawn as if those two positions can both be held in fairness and injustice by the same person. And, forcing people to confront the inherent conflict in those two positions, that if you are genuinely committed to equality, if you are genuinely committed to opportunity, And to fairness, you need to accept that part of that is allowing people to live in your community, making it possible for people to have affordable housing, to live close to jobs and amenities and high quality schools, that these things are the same issue on some very basic level, is a discussion that I think, to say it generously, remains in progress. And so while I think that, you know, we've seen a willingness to engage this question of, okay, Black Lives Matter, and obviously that means the police shouldn't shoot people, but what else does it mean? What else does it need to mean? I think that's a discussion that remains at far too early a stage, and pushing that forward and saying to people, okay, you're against police violence, that's great. That's just one step down this road, is I think a direction that hopefully will be pursued in the coming years.
Yeah, Barika, same question for you. And then if you could also just take it one step further in terms of how can we really live those values where the rubber meets the road in terms of the day-to-day policy in New York City.
Oh yeah, so I mean, I would continue on with your second point, and in that we do have this, and I would say it's not just in the New York City suburbs, it's in parts of New York City, and in actually more parts of New York City than we would maybe expect, that there is the willingness and the interest to have the Black Lives Matter sign, metaphorically, and then next to it have something else, right? We see this playing out in terms of folks who are embracing Black Lives Matter as a mantra, but also opposed to school integration. That is deeply tied into access to affordable housing, housing stability, and addressing homelessness, right? So how do those two things coexist together, and people really recognizing what they are and how they interact as instruments in opposition to true pursuit of Black lives and Black liberation. And I think that the next iteration of this is not just what it looks like for individual people, but what it looks like in our policies and practices as government. And yes, many of our elected officials this administration is eager and willing to stand up and say Black Lives Matter and support that, and right, we're painting things in the streets, but at the same time have historically had a practice of doing things like not expecting and not calling on upzonings and higher density in predominantly wealthy white communities, and asking them and expecting them to take on their share and their responsibility of providing affordable housing as a part of the city's overall strategy and fabric and framework, right? We cannot continue to have an affordable housing approach that lets our privileged and wealthy communities opt out of it, and then expects and anticipates that the rest of the affordable housing problem will be borne out, addressed, and managed within the neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color and predominantly immigrants, right? That's unsustainable geographically. It's unsustainable as a policy approach and as a fundamental agenda. And so I think where we're hopefully headed, where we have to head, period, next, in order to do the next iteration of this, is to say, okay, now what does Black Lives Matter look like in terms of how we're making decisions? How does this change the policies that we have? How does this change how we distribute resources? How does this change our term sheets? How does this change how we enforce our fair housing rules and regulations here in New York City? Things like that, where those are the steps that go beyond the sort of mantra and start to say, okay, now what does this look like when the rubber meets the road?
Yeah, and I think that the Trump phenomenon has kind of brought some of this to the forefront a bit, where the NIMBY language is in some ways no longer as coded. But even as I say that, I feel like there's still a lot of coded language that we do allow, right? Quality of life, neighborhood character, local control over land use decisions. But I've lived in this neighborhood for blah, blah, blah years. Like, these are all things that we allow people to say, and we sort of let them go by. And I think we haven't quite gotten all the way to the point where we can confront that as a city just yet. So where are there other places that are doing this better than us? We're bad at taking advice from other places, but let's try. Are there other cities that have some seeds of ideas that we should be trying out? Binyamin, how about you?
Yeah, so I think that there really are some interesting things happening. So in the first place, we should just set this in a global context and say that, you know, the United States, compared to some other developed nations, is really bad at dealing with these issues. The United States has some factors that make it a more unique or more difficult place to deal with them, but you know, Japan has been enormously successful in addressing homelessness and affordable housing by allowing development and by allowing it in its wealthy neighborhoods. You know, Finland has become an international model for the development of, you know, the government develops housing there. You know, mix of subsidized and market rate units, uses the market rate units to pay for the subsidized stuff, puts enough stuff into the marketplace to keep prices down. You know, there are other developed nations that are doing this much better than we are. So even if New York doesn't want to take lessons from anywhere else in the United States, there are certainly places outside the United States that New York could and should be taking lessons from. And one thing that those communities tend to have in common is that they begin from the premise that homelessness is unacceptable and that they are committed to providing housing for everyone. And we touched on this a little bit before, but you know, the role that shelters have played in New York is, to my mind, pretty ambiguous at best. It has served as a way of sweeping the problem off the stage and has given people a false comfort that homelessness is being addressed and that people in that situation are being helped, when in fact it's anything but. So I think, you know, New York has lessons to learn from other communities around the world. In the United States, I'd point to a couple things that I think are really relevant. The first is that in a number of communities, we're seeing a younger generation of political leaders emerging, who tend to be coming from a different place, both in terms of their own life experiences. Many of them are still renters because they cannot afford to live in their communities. And so they have a level of concern about housing issues that older politicians who do own their homes may not share. They tend to, you know, have grown up in more diverse communities, to have greater sympathy for people who don't look like them, frankly. And they are displaying a level of leadership in places like Minneapolis and Seattle that I think New York might look to and take some lessons from, in terms of the willingness of those communities to embark on transformations of their urban fabric in the interest of broadening access to opportunity and ensuring that people have access to affordable housing. And I think that those are promising examples as well.
Yeah, and I would point to, you know, New York City does like to think that we only know and can figure out things from within ourselves. And I think that is an obstacle and a barrier that we have to sort of move beyond. That doesn't mean that we can wholesale take anything that any other city or locality is doing. But that would probably never be the case, because you always have to adapt other policies and practices to what makes sense for your place. You know, we've moved forward and have looked at things like including for the first time some sort of citywide mandatory inclusionary zoning that was very much tied to and rooted in similar policies that have existed for decades in Montgomery County, Maryland. Huge differences, though, in what ours is now, tied to rezonings, and that has the opportunity for a variety of housing, including sort of opting out for the deep affordability and only doing middle income housing, which is very different than Montgomery County, Maryland's sort of blanket affordability required everywhere as a part of doing business. And, you know, we also see things like in DC, where they're really proactively pursuing a fair share distribution. So saying within the city of DC, not a regional approach, not a statewide approach, but within the city, we're going to figure out how each jurisdiction in DC, it's wards, how each ward or how each council district is responsible for creating and producing their share of affordable housing, and take that on. They're really clear that they don't know how they're going to execute on this, but that they're setting themselves the goal and then are going to try to figure out the tools to meet that goal. It's very much in line with what we saw this administration put forward when it comes to things like Vision Zero. It wasn't like, here's the 100 things that we're going to do on Vision Zero when we know them all. It was, we're going to set an ambitious goal and then try to figure out the different levers. So the question is, why aren't we setting these big ambitious goals when it comes to housing, to say we are going to meet X, we are going to eradicate homelessness in 10 years in New York City, and no, we don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to figure out the different pieces that we need to do over the next few years. We're going to figure out how to double the rate of Black homeownership in New York City, where we know that's incredibly difficult, but we also know that that's the main way that people of color build wealth and build intergenerational wealth, right? These are big goals that we could go after, and it's really a barrier of us setting expectations and setting goals and then really pursuing them relentlessly as a city and as a government.
Yeah, so we at CHPC, we had a couple reps from the DC city government here just as they were launching that plan. And it was fun to spend a couple days with them while that was happening as they were rolling it out, because I was like, wow, how are you guys going to do that? And they're like, we don't know. It's terrifying. And it was just sort of, it was nice to spend some time with folks who, you know, as I am pretty still close to my government days, felt like there was just a great sense of excitement and ambition around coming up with something that you didn't know exactly how it was going to work out. And there was just, it's been a long time since I think we've felt that from our government here. And then in Los Angeles, we had some folks that we were talking to in Los Angeles on this thing called the Everyone In campaign. And it was such a lovely, like, it was such an LA thing, right? They were like, well, this is a PR problem. We know how to solve a PR problem. Like, we're the spin masters around here. So they did a PR campaign saying everyone in LA matters. Everyone in LA is going to do their share for affordable housing. And they did a opinion poll about how people felt about homelessness, and felt like the answers to that poll were not borne out in our policies, and are, you know, really looking at this as a communication strategy, not as a term sheet, not as a government driven thing. And that's been really interesting to see also how I think they've done a better job getting the kind of civic community and the philanthropic community really taking charge, where it's not always going to be a government program, a term sheet that's going to really be the first thing that you do, and getting some real buy-in around that. So it's too soon to turn to the next election, but I'm going to try to muster the courage to do it anyway. What are we looking for in our next mayor to try to help solve these issues? How are we going to balance the kind of management capacity to get some of this stuff done with sharing some of our values and bringing everyone together? Barika.
I mean, so obviously a lot of what happens for our next mayor, and I would also say next city council, is going to depend and bear out on what happens in Washington, and what aid to localities looks like, and what support to local government looks like. But I also think it's important for us to not simply say that it solely rests in Washington's hands. Yes, money is a part of this, but it's not the only part of this. And there are opportunities and ways that we could really think about pursuing strategies that maybe aren't strictly rooted in money. And Jessica, I think this goes back to your point of, right, of not reducing this work to just like, what is the term sheet, right? Like, what is the program? What are the like these are people that experience this in their lives. These are people that experience housing and homelessness in the communities. How do we address that? Not how do we look at the sheet of paper? And so really looking for the next administration to not just tinker around the edges of the framework that we have largely been hampered and shackled to for the past decades, right? Like, yes, New York City produces more affordable housing than almost everybody else in the country. We also are the biggest city. We also put the most money to this. And we also still continue to have the greatest, well, probably top 5, where, you know, there's a few others who vie with us, disparity when it comes to housing, instability and rent burden in the country. So clearly the way that we have been approaching this is not actually moving us forward towards addressing the underlying problem, right? So I think the real question is like, what impact do we want to have? Is the impact that we want to have building a whole bunch of units and then 8 years from now still having the same level of rent burden? Personally, no. Like, that's not what we're focused on at ANHD. The question is, how can we start to change lives and change communities and get us out of this sort of entrapped system that we've been in, so that 10 years from now, we're like, we've got X thousands, X millions less people who are rent burdened. And so now we're having very different conversations about housing.
Yeah, and since you brought up Vision Zero as sort of the example, I mean, how's that been going? You know, we had this amazing vision. We had this, like, you know, game-changing idea that kind of went nowhere in terms of its implementation because of the political will and the management skills necessary to make that happen. So, Binyamin, what do you think is next for the mayor and the council?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I love the example of Vision Zero, and I would begin by saying, listen, I absolutely agree that the first test of a new mayor or of, city council members is basically, the incremental vision is not enough. This sense of, well, we're going to help, to reduce the number of families in homelessness. We're going to, reduce the headcount in the shelters. No, these are not acceptable goals. The goal needs to be, we're going to have a realistic plan for making sure that everyone has affordable housing. We're going to make sure that nobody, ends up in long recurring homelessness. Like, there are goals that are realistic and that go beyond the sort of the frankly, sort of small-minded and kind of cowardly goals that we've seen past administrations set for themselves. And I think, the test of a new mayor on this issue is whether they're willing to embrace the kinds of goals that we actually need, and then figure out how to get there. And to me, that's number one. Number two is I really do believe that it needs to be framed as an affordable housing problem, and that the tendency to speak about homelessness as one silo of issues and affordable housing as a separate silo of issues is not going to get us where we need to be. And so I think, and when I'm talking to politicians about these problems, it's pretty easy to figure out which ones think of it that way and which ones have the necessary understanding that this is an interconnected set of issues that need to be dealt with as an interconnected set of issues. And that for me is a basic test of any mayor or mayoral candidate. But with both of those things said, I do come back to what you just said, which is that, you can have a person whose values are in the right place and who is articulating, the right aspirations and the right goals, and who is not competent to take us there. And, the current mayor, frankly, I think a lot of people would judge him in those terms as someone who came in saying a lot of good things and proved pretty ineffectual at accomplishing them. And there's a lesson there, which is that, the ability to execute matters too.
And
Yeah.
Jessica, can I build on what Binyamin just said? Because I think one piece that all of it, but there's especially the piece of not of talking about affordable housing and talking about really housing in totality as one big group, right? Why are we separating out a plan and a housing conversation on NYCHA, and a plan and conversation on homelessness, and a plan and conversation on affordable housing production, and a different conversation on tenants' rights, and a different conversation on home ownership? These are all ways that people experience housing in our cities. We cannot continue to have these like one-off isolated plans that don't connect to each other, when really they're all about how people live in homes, right? We should not be separating these out. And I would say, I think one thing that is really clear from the movement side, from the advocacy and grassroots and CDCs and nonprofit side, is that we're not doing that anymore. We're not going to be sort of put in our little corners and create a dynamic where we're not communicating with each other. And I actually really think that this is one of the strengths that has come out of COVID and emerged out of COVID, because there was so much crisis, because there was so much rapid response, and also because we were trying to be really clear about not duplicating each other's work, right? There's so much need. I don't need to be doing the same thing as Jessica. So Jessica tells me she's got it, I've got it. When somebody needs it, I send it over to her. When she needs my thing that I'm covering, she sends it over to me, vice versa. And we're doing this in multiple pieces. And from that emerged, like, we're not going to continue to be siloed. We're going to tackle this holistically, the way that we believe housing should be discussed, because I care about the NYCHA tenant in the community the same way I care about somebody who is at risk of homelessness, the same way I care about somebody who is in an affordable housing unit, the same way we care about somebody who's struggling with their mortgage. And those are not separate conversations. They're one unified conversation.
Yeah, I think it's been kind of remarkable just to like get in the little corner of the civic and intermediary world in the city, how it's like even as political as all of our organizations were, it sort of deepened that goal. Whereas 5 years ago, it may not have been made sense for my organization or Barika's organization to sign on to something that the network was working on because that's not our area, or we don't do that, we're a think tank, Like now I feel like everybody has really clearly understood how deeply political this is and how deeply interconnected these issues are. And I do think that that's something that doesn't go away. So that's been a huge step forward. At the same time, I think another thing COVID has laid bare, everyone take a shot every time someone says COVID has laid bare, is you see what happens when you have a city government who can't pick up the garbage on time, right? I mean, the sort of basic day-to-day needs of a city of this size and scale were starting to fray a bit back in the summer and spring and into this point. So I think that the capacity to do something like that and to really execute is, especially on a topic as complicated as housing and homelessness, you know, kind of as a proud member of the deep state, the next mayor is going to have this ship that they're running that you really have to understand how it works in order to get things moving in the right direction. And it can't just be a city hall said X, which I think is part of where we've faced some troubles recently. And then again, we have this management tool that is the housing plan, the unit count, that is incredibly effective and is something to be incredibly proud of. But we've also very cleverly kind of divorced it from the homelessness side of the world, both physically in an org chart and sort of mentally in our communication strategy and in our plans. And it allows these like mission accomplished moments for the affordable housing world, which I think we should feel really a little embarrassed about at this point. Let me take some questions from the group. What do I have here in the chat? It's moving fast. People like the video. I'm glad you guys like the video. Here we have some questions. So we have a question about trade-offs between deeply affordable housing units and unionization. Anyone want to take this one?
I assume this is a question about construction costs effectively, or management costs, yeah?
And operating costs, yeah.
I mean, listen, I think that, you know, I don't think there's an inherent trade-off. I think that a society expresses its values in the way that it manages these things. It ought to be possible for people to be paid a living wage, to construct affordable housing and to manage affordable housing, and for those units still to be affordable for the people who live in them. New York in general has a problem with the management of construction costs on public works. I'm not here to deny that, and it extends into the private sector as well. It's a multifaceted challenge, and it's one that, you know, we're not doing a great job of grappling with. I don't mean to minimize that set of issues, but I reject the idea that there is an inherent trade-off that needs to be made between the quality of life of the people who build and manage housing and the quality of life of the people who live in it.
I think the other piece of this that should be connected is that increasingly many of our partners within labor are understanding that as New York City's housing crisis continues, they see their members in an affordable housing crunch as well, right? So it is not, to Binyamin's point, it's not a us or them, it's not an either or. We are actually really unified in the struggle and in this obstacle, because we cannot continue, like affordable housing can't produce all the units for the entire New York City population, and then also be producing all of the units for labor, because now labor is in a position where they need affordable housing in order to be able to live and sustain, right? So those things are, I think, as the crisis continues and deepens, become more intertwined. I think the other piece is also a better recognition and understanding, to be honest, about many of our partners and elected officials around how affordable housing works and how it gets built. Many times these conversations unfold where the notion is put forward of, oh, well, the affordable housing developers can just reach into their back pockets and reserves. Like that's not the way ANHD's groups and the networks groups and Jessica, you guys' groups do this, right? That they are operating on very thin margins. They do one project to the next. They are mission-oriented and mission-driven organizations, and they pour those projects into supporting their tenants and supporting their broader community. And so it's not a matter of like, I've got this whole set of money in my pocket that I can just now throw to it. It really means that we've got to look at the overall structures. And I think that that's something that we just need to do as a full framework, not just sort of peel it off one piece and then expect that the rest of it is going to shake out and not have other implications.
And if I could just build on that just in one small way, you know, historically here in New York, the labor movement, not here in New York, I'm in DC, but in New York, the labor movement was instrumental in constructing and in supporting the construction of affordable housing for its members. Many of the city's great affordable housing developments had their roots in that union movement and the labor movement. And one would love to see the labor movement take on that broader conception of its public purpose again.
Yeah, and I think the trade-off between, you know, prevailing wages and union labor versus affordable housing construction in its simplest terms, of course, is a true trade-off because it's literally $1 over here or $1 over here. At the same time, there's sort of a deeper question about, to get to the silos point that we've been talking about the housing industry's sort of, we don't have a lot of access to the income section, right? We sort of presume everybody's income is what it is and that it is very low. So now we're sort of seeing seeds of conversations about Section 8 as an entitlement, universal basic income, things would allow us to get to that point where we wouldn't need to be subsidizing the affordable housing construction as much because there is this kind of base level of income that people have, right? That's part, we hear a lot about social housing around the world and sort of elevating that concept. Most of the time, we can't do what they're doing because in those other places that have a very robust social housing program, it's because basically everyone's walking around with a Section 8 voucher in their pocket. So we're not assuming that somebody who cannot pay anywhere near what it would cost to maintain a unit, there's a safety net program that underpins a lot of those programs that just doesn't exist here that we would need in order to make that happen. And then just to plug some of the work that CHPC is doing, it's also a question on both the income and the housing side of who gets to be first in line, right? I think it's totally reasonable. Every labor movement, every non-labor movement in this city should be asking for more money every year, right? I do it every year myself, but the government's job is to figure out who goes first and who needs it the most. So when you're looking at, for example, construction prevailing wages, we had a concern about that as both from a racial equity standpoint, because construction unions tend to not be particularly diverse, and from a gender equity standpoint, because the folks who need affordable housing the most tend to be in the more female dominated businesses. So if you're a home health aide, you're making $24,000 a year, while we're over here fighting about whether a plumber should be making $90,000 or $100,000 a year. So it's also about kind of who gets in the line when we talk about some of these safety net things. And then in terms of shifting the focus, I think we've been doing some, the de Blasio administration, again, finally has rescinded their cuts to the capital budget. I just want to thank New York Housing Conference and Rachel Fee and many of the rest of you for doing a lot of that budget advocacy. Recovery from crises in New York City has always been led by the affordable housing industry. We move forward and create an economic development engine when nobody else wants to turn to New York City. So it was like deeply problematic that the administration decided to cut the capital budget. And then going forward for the next mayor, there's the United for Housing is sort of the umbrella group that we've been moving forward together as a coalition in terms of what we want the next mayor's vision to look like in terms of what the housing agenda is. I have another question here for Binyamin. You mentioned that after the 80s, our country had put its housing resources towards other things. Do you think today in 2020, we have enough resources to eradicate homelessness, or will we need a different type of approach?
I mean, I think this is straightforward. We have enough money to deal with all sorts of things. It's just a question of how we want to use it. And the amount of money that we provide, just to take one very easy comparison, in the form of subsidies to middle class and upper class homeowners, deductions on their mortgage interest, tax exemptions for their capital gains, is significantly more than the best estimates of how much we would need to provide supportive housing for everyone in the United States who needs it. It's not enough to build all the affordable housing we need to address the broader problem, but we have other pots beyond that. And if we indeed wanted to make sure that everyone in the country had access to an entitlement to a Section 8 voucher or some equivalent program, if we wanted to make sure that there were sufficient subsidies to support the construction of a new generation of public housing, to ensure, that we had inclusionary zoning requirements that actually work. This is all pennies on the dollar in terms of the federal budget. It is purely a question of our priorities. It is not at all a question of our resources.
A question for you, Barika. Do you think changing the rezoning laws in New York City could help alleviate this crisis?
So I definitely think that's part of it. And I'm not sure, I guess the question would be why the questioner is asking that. But I think a piece, because some people ask this like, oh, we need more density or we need more this or that. I think the really part of the ANHD's push with our Thriving Communities Coalition to change their ULURP process, this is our land use process, and how we pursue rezonings is rooted around the inequities of how they play out. That they reinforce and reemphasize our existing lines of power and privilege, that communities who are well off get to say no to things and opt out of things, and that communities who have been starved of resources for decades continue to get more things placed on them, and continue to get decisions placed on them that they are either in opposition to or want to see adjusted to better support and serve their communities. So I think there are pieces that are tied to rezonings, but it's not just like, well, we need to get rid of our current zoning process just wholesale because it's a matter of just like allowing unfettered density. I think there's a broader question of, even if that were the case, you still potentially have the same systems in place that allow certain neighborhoods and certain people to move through and others to be stopped. So it's really about creating a framework of fair distribution of resources and development, ensuring that commitments are enforceable, right? There are so many times that commitments come out of various different rezonings and are never enforced, that 10, 20 years later, neighborhoods are looking back and they are saying, you promised me X and they didn't get it. That our development and our integration are happening without displacement and without gentrification. And we have to figure that piece out. And that there's real transparency and accountability in how these things move forward and how they happen. That we can't continue to have rezoning sort of happen behind a closed door and then come out and say, okay, it's done, give like 2 bits of feedback, we may or may not take that, and then we're going to move forward. Like these zonings are impacting people in how and where they live, and there needs to be clear transparency and accountability of how those decisions are made and how people can weigh in on them.
Here's a good one. Will rents in New York City be coming down?
I mean, maybe a little, but not, maybe the pace of increase will be a little slower if we actually see people pulling out. But there's such a vast pent up demand for housing in New York that, even if some people decide that they don't want to be here right now, even if the economy tanks, the historical pattern is pretty clear that there's such a constrained supply of housing in New York that it's really hard to reduce prices in an environment in which construction is heavily constrained. But I just want to make one little note about zoning. We tend to talk about this as a New York City problem. It should be seen as a regional problem. The counties around New York are remarkable for their lack of density. The LA metropolitan area is significantly more dense on average than the New York metropolitan area, which is something that when I tell this to New Yorkers, they often want to argue with me about it. And it's purely because they haven't spent enough time driving around Nassau County or Westchester County or many of the New Jersey suburbs. Some of the answer to New York's affordable housing crisis doesn't need to be in New York City. It's a regional problem and it ought to be viewed that way. And some of the pressure around rezoning ought to be happening in these first ring suburbs where people are basically being subsidized by the government to live at very low densities through land use restrictions that are economically unjustifiable and as a matter of social justice abhorrent.
And then
go ahead.
And then we have a great question about what are some steps we can take to have these housing priorities recognized and addressed? What's our call to action today?
So I would say a call to action on that is for the audience, if they're not already, to get involved with one of your local organizations around pushing forward a inclusive and community-focused housing agenda as a part of this next round of elections that the city is going to go through at every level. That we know that elected officials are and can be responsive to this, but they are and do so in response to the groups that the work that groups do on the ground. And so if we want a very different agenda to be front and center in terms of what housing looks like over the next 10 years, then it's going to be on us to lean into that and push that now as candidates are formulating their platform, as the various different experts and stakeholders are pushing forward an agenda in the back rooms of how politics happens, in order for us to come out of September 2021, which feels eons away right now, with a very different housing agenda for us to move forward on.
Great, Binyamin.
There's a lot of work to be done at the city level and at the state level, but I want to mention something at the federal level. Joe Biden's campaign platform says that he is in favor of providing a Section 8 voucher to everyone who needs one. Holding him to that commitment would be enormously impactful, both as a matter of policy achievement with immediate consequences for tens of thousands of American families, but also as a precedent, as an important step toward making that program an entitlement. It's available. It's something that he has said he wants to do. And I think, for the activist community and the policy community to focus on that, there's a real moment of opportunity here to shift the basic framework around federal subsidies for affordable housing.
Great. So it's 2 o'clock on the nose. I learned a new word today. We're moving past doom scrolling and towards hope scrolling. So I want everyone to get back to your refresh button for a hopefully great night. And thank you so much to the network for hosting this amazing event, and to Barika and Binyamin for an amazing conversation. Thank you.